Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. The sound seems to be very high. So welcome back to this Telos community, to the Telos Forum. We are celebrating the last session of this cycle, Foro Telos, that we have devoted to the being and to the staying and to the will be and will stay. And for those of you who were here and for those who were not here, I will remind you, we devoted our first encounter to cities, sustainable cities. We had Saskia Sassen and Carlos Ratti. The second day, the second session was devoted to the human, digital human. And we have had Juan Luis Arzuaga, we have him here today as well, and Anders Sandberg, who is a neuroscientist, a transhumanist, someone who studies the future and how technology is modifying our way of being. We had a third encounter devoted to creativity, human creativity, and we had with us Rob Roth, a creator, an artist, and Amber Case, who was the cover page of the new era of Telos, and she describes or defines herself as a cyborg being. And we spoke about how we can exploit technology as human beings and how we can use technology for the betterment of society. And we have Jared Diamond with us today, who's going to speak about his last creation, his last work. I'm going to introduce him with some words, but before, I'm going to say that I'm Juan Zafra. I'm the director, the editor-in-chief of Telos. I'm delighted to manage this magazine devoted to technology, business, and human beings. And I would like to repeat that we are not a magazine. We are a community of open knowledge and of collective intelligence. And we are focused on techno-human improvement of society. We believe that technology can lead to a better future. I'm going to devote a few words to describe and define Jared Diamond. You've seen his last book. He's going to speak about it. Diamond is the favorite writer of Bill Gates, as Bill Gates stated at some point. He has written, this book is part of a trilogy, with the first title in 1997. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, and the title was Guns, Germs and Steel, and it dealt with the history of humankind. The second, Collapse, analyzed why there are societies that disappear. And then he wrote The World Until Yesterday, that really has a lot in common and has a clear bond with this last one, Upheaval, because he was asking himself what could we learn in modern societies from the most archaic societies, and what lessons we should learn. In Upheaval, his last book, he asks himself how nations cope with crisis and change, and he analyzes 7 countries that at some point in time have had to face crisis, very relevant upheavals or crisis, and they turned it into an opportunity. Japan, Chile, and Germany, Indonesia, Australia, and Finland, I think. And he devotes a great deal of his book to the main challenges, the great challenges that the humankind is facing. Since the nuclear threat, he states those for climate change, the management of natural resources, and then inequality in the world. Jared is already part of the Telos community because he understands crisis as an opportunity, and that's the models that he analyzes in his book make it very clear. In his books, there is something which is constant. He says that many societies in the past even imploded because of ecological problems, of environmental problems. And I've also heard him say that the present risk is not that societies are going to collapse one after the other, that are going to fail because of globalization. The risk that we are running is to witness the collapse of the whole world. That makes us think, and I've read lots of interviews, that he has an optimistic attitude. But I'm going to give you a spoiler right now, and I'm going to go to the end of the book, because we are going to welcome him to the Telos community reading this word. He finishes saying that these are some of my reasons to ignore pessimists and not renounce hope, but on the contrary, to continue writing about our history and give us the opportunity to learn from history if we decide to. If we decide to learn, and I'll turn the floor over to Jared in order to learn a lot from him. Thank you.
Will you be able to hear me okay? I apologize for not speaking Spanish. I used to be fluent in Spanish. I lived in Peru and in Chile, and Spanish was my best foreign language until I began to learn Italian 20 years ago. And Italian and Spanish are too similar to each other, so I had to suppress my Spanish and, with apologies, talk to you in English today. I first visited Spain in 1970. This is about my 6th visit to your wonderful country. Much has changed since 1970. We never would have guessed then that you would have succeeded so well in making all those changes between 1970 and now. And for me, it's wonderful to be back in your country and see what has changed even in the last 4 years since I was here. The books that I write are books of comparative history. I compare the histories of different societies. Instead of writing a whole book about one country, I don't write books about just Spain. I write books comparing different countries, such as my previous books, Armas Germanes, and my book Collapso. My most recent book compares national political crises in the countries where I've lived and where I speak the language or spoke the language and know best. All of these countries underwent big political crises while I was there or before I was there. I've been working in Indonesia since after the genocide of 1965, when Indonesians killed 500,000 Indonesians. I was living in Chile in 1967 when my Chilean friends did not foresee the horrible things that would happen in 1973 with the Pinochet coup. I was living in Germany in 1961 on the day when the wall, the Berlin Wall, was erected. I began to visit Finland after Finland's winter war against the Soviet Union. I've been working in Australia since 1964, while Australia has slowly been changing its white Australia policy. So all of the countries in which I've lived have experienced national political crises. That doesn't mean that if Jared Diamond lives in a country, that's going to be the cause of a national political crisis. Instead, it's simply that most countries undergo national political crises, each of which is a powerful story by itself, but they also raise practical questions of why some countries deal with crises better than other countries. Maybe we can learn from these past crises in ways that will help us deal better with our present crises. You may say, but there are already many books on national political crises. Why do we need another book by Jared Diamond? What can he say that's new about this subject that so many historians have discussed? I'm looking at national political crises from a new perspective, the perspective offered by personal crises, the personal crises that I'm sure every one of you here has experienced. All of us experience personal crises due to the breakdown of marriages or relationships, the deaths of loved ones, a setback to one's career or to one's health or to one's finances. All of these personal crises make us ask ourselves, what did I do wrong to get myself into this mess? What do I have to change about myself so that I can live a better life now after this crisis? Naturally, I'm interested in personal crises because I've lived through my own share of them, but also because my wife, Marie, is a clinical psychologist with a specialty in helping people undergoing personal crises. Psychologists usually see people for long times, for a few years, to deal with long-standing problems. But crisis therapists help people who come in with a sudden crisis, such as the breakdown of a marriage or the death of a loved one. A crisis therapist has to help the client quickly because there's the risk, in the worst case, that the client may commit suicide. And so each week, Marie and her fellow therapists got together to discuss the clients in their office, who was doing well, who was not doing well, and figuring out what makes it likely that a person will deal well with a personal crisis. I'm sure all of you from your experience have some sense of why some people deal better with crises than with others. And each week on Friday, Marie would come home, we would have dinner, and Marie would then tell me about the dozen or so factors that she and her fellow therapists recognized as making it more or less likely that a person would deal with a personal crisis. I then realized, I think that some similar factors apply to the outcomes of national crises, and so that's the perspective of my book, the perspective that personal crises offer for understanding national crises. Let me give you an example. The crisis of Japan in the 1800s, when after a couple of centuries of being isolated from the rest of the world, Japan was forced to open up to the world by the arrival of an American fleet and the risk that Japan would undergo the fate of China of being forcibly opened to the rest of the world. That was a crisis for Japan, which Japan solved so successfully that within about 50 years, from 1853 to 1910, Japan transformed itself from an isolated feudalistic society to a modern industrial society. Japan's negotiating that crisis illustrates many of Marie's dozen outcome predictors, which I'm sure you recognize yourself as I talk about them. All of you will know from your own experience or from watching friends that the first step in resolving your own personal crisis is to acknowledge that you're in a crisis. If you don't acknowledge that it's a crisis, you're not going to do anything about resolving it. We have a crisis. In the case of Japan, the Japanese quickly recognized that, yes, they faced a crisis, that they were going to have to change, otherwise they were likely to be invaded. So Japan acknowledged the first step towards resolving a crisis. You also know from your own experience that the next step in resolving a personal crisis is to accept responsibility for making changes. if you just say, oh, I'm in a mess, poor me, it's the fault of those other people, those bad people there. If you don't accept responsibility that you have to do something, you have to change to resolve the crisis, then you're not going to succeed. The Japanese quickly recognized they had to change, they had to make lots of changes in order to become strong and resolve their crisis. You also know from your own experience that if you're in a personal crisis and you recognize you have to change something about yourself, it doesn't mean that you're going to throw away everything about yourself. Instead, you know that you recognize something about me isn't working and I have to change it, but the rest about me is okay. I have to make some selective change. Selective, the word selective change, is the essence to resolving crises. And Japan was an outstanding example of selective change. Japan changed a lot, and there was much that it did not change. Japan continued to have an emperor. Japan continued to write in their beautiful kanji script. Japan continued to be one of the most distinctive countries in the world. Those things remain constant, but other things changed. Japan changed its form of government to a parliamentary cabinet government. Japan adopted a national fleet. It adopted a national army. It industrialized. It adopted a national system of education. That's selective change. Again, you all know from experience that if you're in a crisis, a personal crisis, it makes a big difference if you can get help from friends, if you can turn to friends and get emotional support from them, or if you can get material support. And I'm sure you also know from experience that in a personal crisis, it helps a lot if you have friends who went through a similar crisis and you can look to them for models of how to resolve the crisis. Japan is the outstanding example in modern times of a country that used other countries as models for resolving a crisis. For each problem, Japan identified the country, the European country or the United States, whose solution to that problem was best suited to Japanese circumstances. And so Japan recognized that it had to develop a strong fleet. Who had the best fleet in the world in the 1800s? Britain. So Japan modeled its fleet on the British fleet. Japan recognized that it needed to have an army. Who had the strongest army in the 1800s? Germany. Japan modeled its army on the German army. Japan recognized that it had to build up a national system of education, and so it modeled that on the American system initially. Japan recognized that it needed to have a civil court system, which it modeled on the French court system. So Japan looked in each situation for the model best suited to Japanese circumstances. And again, you all know from your own experience in dealing with a crisis, you have to be honest with yourself. If you don't admit honestly what are your weaknesses, but also if you don't recognize honestly what are your strengths, you're not going to be able to resolve the crisis. Japan was outstandingly honest in the 1800s. It was very careful in its territorial expansion. It was honest about its strength, honest about what it could do and what it could not do. So first, Japan annexed Hokkaido, and then it realized it was strong enough to annex Okinawa, and then it recognized that it was strong enough to attack China, and then it recognized in 1904 that it was strong enough to attack Russia, and in 1914 it recognized that it was strong enough to attack German colonies. At each stage, Japan was honest about assessing its strength, and it didn't make mistakes then. In contrast to the 1930s, when Japan was not honest about its strengths compared to the strengths of the United States and European countries, with a result of disaster for Japan, that Japan was initiated a World War II that it could only lose because it had not honestly assessed its strength. So those are examples then of a country, Japan in the 1800s, that successfully resolved a crisis in ways that I'm sure all of you here have successfully resolved personal crises. That's a happy story. Let's now turn to an unhappy story. My own country today, the United States. The United States is moving into a crisis. The problems of the United States are ones that I'm sure you've read about or some of you have seen firsthand. Our problems include political polarization. The right and the left cannot reach agreement, the Republicans and the Democrats. But it's worse than that. Within the Republican Party or within the Democratic Party, there's disagreement. And it's still worse than that. There's disagreement within the United States. My state of California is now suing the federal government, and the federal government is suing California. This issue of breakdown of political compromise, of political polarization, I understand from my Spanish friends, is something of concern to you today in Spain. The United States has other problems, problems of voter registration. In Spain, when an election is coming up, or in Germany when an election is coming up, you don't have to do anything special. The Spanish state knows of your existence. It will send you a letter saying, the election is on this day in this place, go vote there, or send in a ballot. In the United States, it's not that way. American citizens have to register to vote, and political parties in each state or in each city make it difficult for citizens they think are going to vote for the other party to vote. And so, for example, in the state of Alabama, where the central government is Republican, there are lots of African Americans likely to vote Democratic, but the state of Alabama says that in order to vote, it's not enough to be a citizen. You have to show either a passport or a driver's license. But lots of African Americans in Alabama don't have a passport or driver's license. They're likely to vote Democratic. And so the state of Alabama, with its Republican government, decreed that in counties with an African American majority, in order to vote, you have to show a driver's license. But most African Americans there did not have a driver's license. In order to prevent African Americans from getting a driver's license, the state of Alabama closed down the government offices that issue driver's licenses in those Alabama counties with African American majorities. And when the courts said, when our courts told the state of Alabama, you must open the offices to issue driver's licenses in counties with African American majorities, yes, the state of Alabama opened those offices one day a month. Those are ways in which Americans now are prevented from voting. And other problems of the United States are our inequality, our socioeconomic immobility, the difficulties of a poor American to become rich, and the decline of government investment. Those are problems of the United States. If you apply my wife Marie's outcome predictors, how is the United States doing at resolving its problems at present? Not very well. Our president doesn't acknowledge our problems. Insofar as he does acknowledge them, he denies responsibility, but instead blames our problems on Canada and Mexico and on China. But the only people who can destroy American democracy are we Americans, not Mexicans and Chinese and Canadians. And then perhaps most worrisome, the United States refuses to use other countries as models for resolving our problems. You know from your own experience, if your marriage has ever been in difficulty, you may have learned from friends who've had marital difficulties themselves how to get through marital difficulties. Well, the problems of the United States that include problems of education and voting and health, Spain and Germany and Western European countries, and Canada and Australia and Japan do better than the United States at problems of national health systems or voter registrations. But we Americans believe in what's called American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States is so unique that there's nothing that we can learn from any other country, which is absolute nonsense. Yes, the United States is unique, but Portugal is unique and Bolivia is unique. The United States shares problems of health care and education with other countries, but we will not look to Spain and Germany and Canada and Japan for how to solve our problems. This reminds me of something that I've learned in the past few days while I've been in Spain. I'm told that your most acute problem today is the problem of Catalonia, the risk of secession in Catalonia. Well, Spain is not the only country in the world that has problems of distinctive regions where there are issues of secession. There are other countries that have had issues of secession that have solved these issues rather well. Countries to which you might be able to look as models of how to solve the issues of Catalonia. The Netherlands, with its minority of Friese in Friesland, or Switzerland, with 4 different languages. So in Spain you have 4 languages: Basque, Castilian, Catalan, and Galician. In Switzerland there are 4 languages, but the Swiss are very careful about managing their 4 languages. Each of the 4 language groups is guaranteed to have a certain number of votes in Parliament, and the presidency of Switzerland rotates so that for a year Switzerland has a Swiss-German president, and then an Italian-Swiss president, then a French-Swiss president, then a Romansh-Swiss president. What about in Spain rotating the prime ministership so that for a couple of years you have a Castilian prime minister, and then for a year you're guaranteed to have a Catalan prime minister, and then for a year you're guaranteed to have a Basque prime minister, and then for a year you're guaranteed to have a Galician prime minister. That might go some distance towards satisfying the concerns of Catalans. So this simply illustrates that Spain could look to other countries as models for dealing with secessions. Spain could look to Canada and its resolution of the Quebec problem. Spain could look to New Zealand and its dealing with the Maoris. Spain could look to the Netherlands. Spain could look to Switzerland as good examples, and Spain could also look as bad examples for how not to deal with a polarization within the country. You could look to Germany and how Germany has messed up the problems of East Germany, and you could look to Italy as an example of how Italy has messed up the problems of southern Italy. So I wonder, you can judge better whether Spain might avoid the modern American problem of ignoring models and looking to other countries as models for how to deal with your difficult secession issue in Catalonia, but it's no more difficult than Canada's secession issue in Quebec. Finally, since I've talked about subjects that may seem heavy subjects, national crises, let's now talk about a light, easy subject, the problems of the whole world. What are the problems of the whole world? The world faces a number of problems. What are the most serious problems of the world? Jared Diamond will now reveal to you what are the world's 4 most serious problems, but you already know them. The problem of the use of nuclear weapons between India and Pakistan, between the United States and North Korea, between Israel and someday Iran. The nuclear problem is the problem that could kill the most people in the shortest time. You also know you're concerned about the problem of climate change, which threatens the whole world, not as quickly as the nuclear problem, but quickly enough. You all know about the problem of the unsustainable use of world resources, that we all depend upon natural resources such as fish and forests and water and topsoil, but the world is managing its natural resources unsustainably, and we're going to run out of them within a few decades. And you know about the problem of inequality around the world, that there are poor countries and there are rich countries, and some of those poor countries are very close to you, like a few kilometers away, and it's unsustainable in this globalized world for there to be both rich countries and poor countries when people are able to move around, including when terrorists are able to move around. Should we be pessimistic about our chances of solving the problems of the whole world? At first you might say, where can we get help? Where can we look to for models? We cannot turn to those six-legged creatures with green horns on the planet Mars to help us for solving our world problems. We cannot look to other creatures for models. We cannot look to the Andromeda Nebula and see how purple creatures with 12 legs solve the problem of climate change in the Andromeda Nebula. We can't look for help. We can't look for models. That might make one pessimistic, but the fact is that the world has succeeded in solving some rather difficult problems within recent decades. We've managed to eliminate the worst disease of human history, smallpox, as a worldwide effort, and boy was that difficult, getting the last cases of smallpox in Somalia, but it succeeded. The world has succeeded in delineating coastal economic zones so that Spain and Portugal and Spain and France, as well as Thailand and Malaysia, no longer argue about coastal economic zones. The world has succeeded in getting chlorofluorocarbon gases which destroyed the ozone layer out of the atmosphere. Those are examples of major world problems that the world has succeeded in solving. And that gives me some cautious optimism that the world will also succeed in solving these other problems, the nuclear problem and the climate change problem. Nevertheless, one has to acknowledge that the world is facing serious problems today. Should we be optimistic or should we be pessimistic? I would compare our present situation in the world to a horse race, a race between two horses. There's the horse of destruction and the horse of hope solving our problems. But this is an unusual horse race. In the normal horse race, the horses start out of the starting gate and they run at constant speed all the way up to the finish line. In our current world horse race between the horse of destruction and the horse of hope of solving problems, this is an exponentially accelerating horse race in which the horses are going faster and faster. The horse of destruction is going faster and faster. There are more and more people with higher and higher consumption rates. But the horse of hope is also going faster and faster because more and more people are recognize and are concerned about these world problems and are trying to do something to solve them. At the rate we're going now, because we are on an unsustainable course, we can't continue on this course for more than a few decades. By the year 2050, long after I'm dead, but in the year 2050, my twin sons will be 63 years old. They were born in 1987, and so I have a personal interest in the outcome of this horse race. I'm cautiously optimistic that because the world's problems are ones that we are causing ourselves, we are capable of resolving the world's problems. I hope so. And on that cheerful note, we have some time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Jared. I enjoy a lot reading, honestly.
We are going to place 3 seats because Jared offered to establish a dialogue with all of you, with all of us. he cannot use the headset, and so in order to make it more agile, Manuel is going to help us with translation together with him. He's going to sit close to him, and I will be here. So Jared, please, if you can come to the stage.
Mejor tú en el medio, Manuel, y yo aquí. De manera que con Manuel aquí.
So with Manuel here, you will also be able to ask questions in Spanish. We have half an hour for this discussion.
Got it. In our countries, global problems and local problems in our countries. I have two questions to start. Who are responsible of this problem? What can we do to solve it?
Who are responsible for the world's problems? You, me,
Well,
everybody in the
me too.
world. The world's problems are not caused by an asteroid rushing onto the world. The world's problems are caused by 7.5 billion humans. And what can we do to solve the world's problems? We can stop causing the world's problems. You know how we're causing the world's problems. We're causing them by consuming too much fossil fuels, by consuming too much energy, by allowing inequality to exist around the world. We can consume less fossil fuels. We can build more wind generations, as you have in Spain. We can do things to reduce inequality around the world. So it's our responsibility to solve our problems.
Yeah. Well, you talk about that. How can we solve it?
How can...
Is that our priority is to change this way? Nuestras prioridades para cambiar en esto.
Our priority is to change in this path towards pessimism.
Us to change.
Yeah. Changing our priorities. Instead of worrying about bagatelles, trivial little things like in the United States, what new car to buy, and whether our new car should be bigger, and whether the World Rugby Cup should have been won by South Africa or by England, we need to devote more efforts to the big problems facing the world.
Yeah. Talking about the global problems, do you trust that it's possible to agree different countries to solve these global problems when we are living an increasing of nationalism, commercial or economic war? It's possible to find again these threats that you write in your book?
Is it possible to solve these global problems when nationalism is increasing? We've already solved problems like smallpox and economic zones and the ozone layer. Here in Europe, you know very well what you've succeeded in doing in the last 70 years in solving problems within Europe. I first came to Europe in 1950. And when I came to Europe in 1950, when you took a train between Spain and France and Germany, the train stopped at the border for 2 hours while officials checked all your passports, and then you had to change all your money. Nowadays, when I flew on Monday from Germany to Spain, I had forgotten how it was, and I arrived at Madrid airport, and I thought I would have to pull out my passport. No, I didn't have to pull out my passport. That's wonderful success within Europe in the last 70 years, thanks to the European Union in resolving problems within Europe. But no part of the world has had worse problems with lethal nationalism than Europe. And because you solved some of those problems in the last 70 years, yes, you have populism today, but you solve much worse problems of populism in the last 70 years. So I'm more optimistic about the European Union than I am about the United States.
Yeah. You said this morning that that's politically incorrect, but you said that we have in the United States a great problem that is called Donald Trump, and you said
yes. we have in the United States this
and you said
object called Donald Trump, who has been referred to in many ways, but you are being very kind in referring to him as a problem.
Well, because you said that you have 3 different kind of president in the United States in your history. So you define these 3 kinds.
In American history. So in Spanish history, you've had good prime ministers and less good prime ministers, and you've had good kings and less good kings, and good dictators and less good dictators. In the United States, until the year 2016, we've had good presidents, we've had strong presidents, and we've had weaker presidents. We've had good presidents and less good presidents, but we have never had an evil president. And now, for the first time, we have an evil president.
Wow. Bueno. That's terrific. Talking about, you mentioned United European Community. I'm talking about a global institution. Do you trust on any global institution, organization as United Nations to solve the global problems?
What global institutions can help in solving global problems? Fortunately, there are many of them. Yes, there's the United Nations, but there are others. There's the World Health Organization, which took the lead in eliminating smallpox. There are non-governmental organizations. For example, among environmental organizations, I'm on the board of directors in the United States of World Wildlife Fund, which in Europe I believe you call Worldwide Fund for Nature. And the Worldwide Fund for Nature and other environmental organizations make big contributions towards solving world problems. So we don't depend only on the United Nations. There are many world organizations that help in solving world problems.
Vamos a abrir la palabra para...
Let's open up the floor to the audience. We have Manuel that will help us with the translation. As you see, Jared is not very politically correct. He's not friends with political correctness. I'm not either. So we are going to open up the Q&A session. There's someone asking for the floor there. They will bring you a mic there. Someone or here.
You are the excluded here. We're the ones you cannot see. Welcome to Madrid. We're here. Voy a preguntar en español.
I'm going to ask in Spanish. And there are 2 models. Can I ask in English?
One's led by United States. The other one is led by China. And those 2 models exclude everybody else. Do you think that the connection of the excluded ones will be able to make a new model? Thank you.
Fortunately, there are more models than just the United States or just China. We are in the middle of a model, the European Union, which I prefer to either the United States or to China. I know that in Europe now, you have some pessimism and concern about the problems of the EU. And yes, the EU does have problems, but the United States does have worse problems, and China has even worse problems. So we don't have only the American model. At present, the American model is not a happy model. And we don't have only the Chinese model, which at present is a very unhappy model, and I think will remain an unhappy model for the indefinite future because China is a democracy. There are other models, your model, the Japanese model, the Australian model.
Over there seems to be lots of questions.
Madrid. My question is, what can we do about the political representation crisis? I feel there's a lot of turmoil in Latin America, for example, at the moment, that has me absolutely worried and terrified. And I feel that it's possible that the political polarization can grow, can expand, if there's a populist leader that, you know, captures attention of the voters. How can we defend democracy now? Thank you.
How can we defend democracy, for example, against populist leaders? There is only one way that you can defend democracy, and that's by voting. Particularly in the United States, the highest turnout that the United States ever had in a significant election was in the 2008 presidential election, when only 61% of Americans voted. In Italy, since World War II, there has never been an election in Italy where less than 85% of Italians voted. In Indonesia, which had no experience of democracy, when Indonesia regained democracy in what was it, the year 2000, Indonesia's first democratic election, 93% of Indonesians went to the polls. Why is it that we Americans can't vote? You Americans have you Europeans have a better record of voting, but what can you do? The first thing you got to do is to vote. Britain, rather soon, in a couple of weeks, Britain is going to have a very important election, the Brexit election. If the British people end up in a mess, it's going to be a mess entirely of their own making because of how they voted. In Spain, you've had an election recently. You had an election about a year or so ago. You've not been entirely satisfied with the results of your two most recent elections. Well, keep having more elections until you have an election with whose outcome you are satisfied.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions.
Hello, and thank you, Mr. Diamond. Well, I'm thinking, do you think at least partly crises are created? By who and why, when there are some people, normally people representing us, why do we follow them in this way? Hate is increasing and increasing. What can we do about that?
Why do we follow bad leaders, for example? Bad judgment. Why did 49% of Americans vote for a bad leader in the last election? Bad judgment. But we have another chance. There's going to be another election in November 2020, and we'll see whether 51% of Americans exercise bad judgment again.
We will change to this side.
Buenas tardes, Mr. Diamond.
Good afternoon, Mr. Diamond. The same as in the U.S., like in the US, you have that feeling of being very different, of being very special. In Spain, since the 1960s, we have a motto that to attract tourism that said, Spain is different. It is still weighing in our subconscious. Do you think that that happens in many other countries? Do you think that is the case? And if that is the case, why do they think that they are special, and how can we create a vaccine against that feeling of being very special, of not being able to apply other people's solutions?
The United States thinks that it's very special. Here in Spain, you have a neighboring country, Portugal, whose language is rather similar to your language, and you have another country a few hundred kilometers away, Italy, whose language is rather similar to your language. So Spain seems less distinctive than the United States. On the other hand, Spain is a small country that has had enormous influence on the world for nearly 1,000 years. When you think of Spanish contributions to knowledge of the world, and when you think of Spanish contributions to the arts, if you had to name the world's 37 greatest painters of history, probably 18 of them would be Spanish. So yeah, Spain in some ways is a less distinctive country than in the United States, but in other ways historically it's a more distinctive country than the United States. And Spain and other European, and 26 other European countries have had the good sense to form a European Union.
Buenas tardes, Mr. Diamond.
Good afternoon, Mr. Diamond. Your book, Guns, Germs and Steel, and the Law of Entropy, and Richard Dawkins have led me to think about a history of factors, not so much about characters, but about factors. Your last book, Upheaval, deals with short-term crisis, perhaps, and the crisis I'm thinking about for the 2050, for example, are the growth of population, the lack of raw materials for that huge growth, and the environmental problems. I believe that your thinking has gone from a global topic to a more short-term topic, because crisis, Spain is going to disappear. I don't know if in 100 years or 150 years it will be part of the European Union or whatever, and perhaps by 2050 I don't know how things are going to look like. But these small crises are less important than the big crisis that I have just mentioned. The book has two parts: the analysis of the crisis and the countries that have gone through crisis, Russia, Japan, Australia, and then the global crisis. But he's going to explain that more in detail.
Good question. Issues about short-term and long-term crises, and issues about local crises and global crises. On the question of local crises versus global crises, until this century, there were only local crises. There was never a global crisis in the world. And only in the last 60 years has it been possible for there to be a global crisis because of globalization, because of increased transport and increased communication around the world. In the past, all crises were local. When the Roman Empire fell, nobody in China knew about it, nobody in Mexico was affected by it. But nowadays, when government falls in any country, when government falls in Somalia or Afghanistan, it affects the whole world. Now, for the first time in human history, we have world crises. And then on the question of short-term crises versus long-term crises, some of my book, Armas Gérmenes, was about long-term issues. My current book, Upheaval, is about short-term issues. I have friends who are concerned about what will happen 200 years from now. I don't care about what will happen 200 years from now, because the only important question is what's going to happen in the next 30 years. In the next 30 years, either we develop a sustainable economy, or if we've not developed a sustainable economy by 2050, it's too late. If we have developed a sustainable economy by 2050, then we have plenty of time to be concerned about insignificant little things like artificial intelligence and biotechnology. First, we have to get onto a sustainable economy, and we have 30 years to do it.
No me dejan hacer esto, pero puedo.
I'm not allowed to do this, but can I ask a question? Speaking about local crisis and global crisis, do you find any relationship between the protests in Chile, Bolivia, Hong Kong? Is there any link between them all, from your point of view?
Very interesting question. The unrest in Chile in the last month, which surprised me, and I think surprised many Chileans, because Chile had gotten through the 17 years of Pinochet and seemed to be going in a smoother direction. But Chile has now developed problems and people are on the streets again. But one shouldn't be surprised. Here on planet Earth, there are not happy answers that go on forever. You all know from your own experience that if you've had marital difficulties and you resolve your marital difficulties, that doesn't guarantee that without effort you're going to have a happy marriage for the rest of your life. You will probably have further marital difficulties. And so in Chile, despite the end of Pinochet, there are difficulties in Chile now. There are difficulties in Bolivia now. Does this mean a worldwide pattern? No, I do not see worldwide significance to Chile at the moment. I do not see worldwide significance to Bolivia at the moment. I see potential worldwide significance to right-wing populism, which is appearing in quite a few countries, raising broader questions.
Mm-hmm. We have to be optimistic anyway. We have to be optimistic anyway.
We must be optimistic.
Yes, we must be. We must be optimistic, but we can be optimistic. We can be optimistic because the problems facing the world are problems that we are causing ourselves, and so we can solve the problems. And we must be optimistic. Some writers about environmental problems write pessimistic books, and that's unfortunate, because if you write a pessimistic book saying that the world's problems are unsolvable, why should any of you make any effort to solve the world's problems if you've just been told that they're insoluble? It is our responsibility to make an effort to be as optimistic as is honestly possible.
Nos da tiempo para una pregunta y
We have time for one or two more questions. Two questions. Okay.
Hello, Jared. Thanks for coming. You were talking before about different models in the global economy. I wonder, what do you think? Right now we have the United States and maybe China that is sort of fighting for global, I wouldn't say supremacy, I don't know, like getting the hegemony, right? But what do you think about Europe in that geopolitical context? Because right now we have a new president of the European Commission, and I think we are kind of tackling the problems you say, because she said that we are going to have a greener economy and all that. But I wonder, do you think that the future of Europe is integrating ourselves like you did in the United States and becoming a federal Europe with our own army? Or that's maybe science fiction for now? What do you think about it? Thanks.
My sense is that I like the European Union more than most Europeans do. And I'm more optimistic about the EU than are most Europeans. Comparatively speaking, your problems are milder than our problems. Within the last 70 years, you've made amazing progress. The European Union collectively has a larger population than the United States. The EU collectively, I think its economy collectively is not quite as large as that of the United States, but nevertheless it's one of the world's 5 largest economies. And so I look to the EU as a model for how to solve. If any of you are old enough to remember World War II, if any of you are old enough to remember 1945 and the opening of the concentration camps, nothing could have been worse than Europe in 1945. And yet Europe has made such progress since. There has not been a war between nations of the EU in the last 70 years. That's incredible when you think of Europe in 1945. Therefore, I'm an admirer of the European Union.
Tenemos tiempo para...
We have time for...
Después vamos a tener...
After that, we will have Jared signing books, and I don't want to exhaust him. And there are several requests for the word.
Which one?
What? Sorry, to make sure.
Wow. Increíble.
Could someone help me? That one.
something I found very interesting in your book, Weapons, Germs and Steel, you also spoke about marriages when you were speaking about domestication. And you mentioned that the 7 or 8 factors for animal domestication, if one was wrong, it would never happen. And you said, like marriage. And today you've also spoken about marriages to think about crisis. So my question is, I always thought that vision about a marriage working was very strict, or you have all the things working or it doesn't go. My question is, has your vision on that changed since that book?
My vision on happy marriages has not changed. My book, Armas Germanes, was published in 1997 at a time when Marie, my wife, and I had been married for 16 years, and Marie and I have now been married for 38 years, and to my surprise, I would not have expected 40 years ago that a marriage could get happier and happier for 38 years and better, and that a woman could get more and more beautiful. But Marie at age 71 is more beautiful than she was when I met her at age 30. And so a big cause of my optimism is I have a wonderful wife and I have wonderful children. And that is a good note on which to end.
Thank you. Well, I have a last one. Is there an end in the history? Is there an end to the story? Or which is your next book?
Is there an end to history? Hopefully not. And what is my next book? My next book will be revealed to you in about 4 years.
Thank you very much. A pleasure. Gracias. Excuse me, my Spanglish. Y ahora tenemos la firma.
Now he will be signing books for those of you who want to get a signed copy of his last book. Thank you.